Chapter 22 of The Gold Hunters by J. D. Borthwick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Chapter 22, Sonora and the Mexicans. From Angel's Camp I went on a few miles to Carson's Creek, on which there was a small camp lying at the foot of a hill, which was named after the same man. On its summit a quartz vein cropped out in large masses to the height of 30 or 40 feet, looking at a distance like the remains of a solid wall of fortification. It had only been worked a few feet from the surface, but already an incredible amount of gold had been taken out of it. Every place in the mines had its tradition of wonderful events which had occurred in the olden times, that is to say, as far back as '49, for 3 years in such a vast country were equal to a century, and at this place the tradition was that when the quartz vein was first worked, the method adopted was to put in a blast, and after the explosion to go round with hand baskets and pick up the pieces. I believe this was only a slight exaggeration of the truth, for at this particular part of the vein there had been found what is there called a pocket, a spot not more than a few feet in extent where lumps of gold in unusual quantities lie embedded in the rock. No systematic plan had been followed in opening the mine with a view to the proper working of it, but several irregular excavations had been made in the rock wherever the miners had found the gold most plentiful. For nearly a year it had not been worked at all, in consequence of several disputes as to the ownership of the claims, and in the meantime the lawyers were the only parties who were making anything out of it. On the other side of the hill, however, was a claim on the same vein, which was in undisputed possession of a company of Americans, who employed a number of Mexicans to work it under the direction of an experienced old Mexican miner. They had 3 shafts sunk in the solid rock in a line with each other to the depth of 200 feet, from which galleries extended at different points where the gold-bearing quartz was found in the greatest abundance. No ropes or windlasses were used for descending the shafts, but at every 30 feet or so there was a sort of step or platform, resting on which was a pole with a number of notches cut all down one side of it, and the rock excavated in the various parts of the mine was brought up in leathern sacks on the shoulders of men who had to make the ascent by climbing a succession of these poles. The quartz was then conveyed on pack mules down to the river by a circuitous trail, which had been cut on the steep side of the mountain, and was there ground in the primitive Mexican style in rasters. The whole operation seemed to be conducted at a most unnecessary expenditure of labor, but the mine was rich, and even worked in this way, it yielded largely to the owners. Numerous small wooden crosses were placed throughout the mine, in niches cut in the rock for their reception, and each separate part of the mine was named after a saint who was supposed to take those working in it under his immediate protection. The day before I visited the place had been some saint's day, and the Mexicans, who of course had made a holiday of it, had employed themselves in erecting, on the side of the hill over the mine, a large cross about 10 feet high, and had completely clothed it with the beautiful wild flowers which grew around in the greatest profusion. In fact, it was a gigantic cruciform nosegay, the various colors of which were arranged with a great deal of taste. The mine is on the great quartz vein which traverses the whole state of California. It has a direction northeast and southwest, perfectly true by compass, and from many points where an extensive view of the country is obtained, It can be distinctly traced for a great distance as it crops out here and there, running up a hillside like a colossal stone wall, and then disappearing for many miles, till, true to its course, it again shows itself, crowning the summit of some conical shaped mountain, and appearing in the distant view like so many short white strokes, all forming parts of the same straight line. The general belief was that at one time all the gold in the country had been embedded in quartz, which, being decomposed by the action of the elements, had set the gold at liberty to be washed away with other debris, and to find a resting place for itself. Rich diggings were frequently found in the neighborhood of quartz veins, but not invariably so, for different local causes must have operated to assist the gold in traveling from its original starting point. As a general rule, the richest diggings seemed to be in the rivers, at those points where the eddies gave the gold an opportunity of settling down instead of being borne further along by the current, or in those places on the highlands where, owing to the flatness of the surface or the want of egress, the debris had been retained while the water ran off. For the first idea one formed from the appearance of the mountains was that they had been very severely washed down, but that there had been sufficient earth and debris to cover their nakedness, and to modify the sharp angularity of their formation. I crossed the Stanislaus, a large river, which does not at any part of its course afford very rich diggings, by a ferry which was the property of 2 or 3 Englishmen, who had lived for many years in the Sandwich Islands. The force of the current was here very strong, and by an ingenious contrivance was made available for working the ferry. A stout cable was stretched across the river, and traversing on this were 2 blocks, to which were made fast the head and stern of a large scow. By lengthening the stern line, the scow assumed a diagonal position, and under the influence of the current and of the opposing force of the cable, she traveled rapidly across the river, very much on the same principle on which a ship holds her course with the wind abeam. Ferries or bridges on much traveled roads were very valuable property. They were erected at those points on the rivers where the mountain on each side offered a tolerably easy ascent, and where, in consequence, a line of travel had commenced. But very frequently more easy routes were found than the one first adopted. Opposition ferries were then started, and the public got the full benefit of the competition between the rival proprietors, who sought to secure the traveling custom by improving the roads which led to their respective ferries. In opposition to this ferry on the Stanislaus, another had been started a few miles down the river, so the Englishmen, in order to keep up the value of their property and maintain the superiority of their route, had made a good wagon road, more than a mile in length, from the river to the summit of the mountain. After ascending by this road, and traveling 5 or 6 miles over a rolling country covered with magnificent oak trees, and in many places fenced in and under cultivation, I arrived at Sonora, the largest town of the southern mines. It consisted of a single street, extending for upwards of a mile along a sort of hollow between gently sloping hills. Most of the houses were of wood, a few were of canvas, and 1 or 2 were solid buildings of sun-dried bricks. The lower end of the town was very peculiar in appearance as compared with the prevailing style of California architecture. Ornaments seemed to have been as much consulted as utility, and the different tastes of the French and Mexican builders were very plainly seen in the high-peaked overhanging roofs, the staircases outside the houses, the corridors round each story, and other peculiarities, giving the houses, which were painted moreover buff and pale blue, quite an old-fashioned air alongside the staring white rectangular fronts of the American houses. There was less pretense and more honesty about them than about the American houses, for many of the latter were all front and gave the idea of a much better house than the small, rickety, clapboard or canvas concern which was concealed behind it. But these facades were useful as well as ornamental, and were intended to support the large signs which conveyed an immense deal of useful information. Some small stores, in fact, seemed bursting with intelligence, and were broken out all over with short, spasmodic sentences in English, French, Spanish, and German, covering all the available space save the door, and presenting to the passer-by a large amount of desultory reading as to the nature of the property within and the price at which it could be bought. This, however, was not by any means peculiar to Sonora. It was the general style of thing throughout the country. The Mexicans and the French also were very numerous, and there was an extensive assortment of other Europeans from all quarters, all of whom, save French, English, and Italians, were in California classed under the general denomination of Dutchmen, or more frequently D Dutchmen, merely for the sake of euphony. Sonora is situated in the center of an extremely rich mining country, more densely populated than any other part of the mines. In the neighborhood are a number of large villages, one of which, Columbia, only 2 or 3 miles distant, was not much inferior in size to Sonora itself. The place took its name from the men who first struck the diggings and camped on the spot, a party of miners from the state of Sonora in Mexico. The Mexicans discovered many of the richest diggings in the country, not altogether perhaps through good luck, for they had been gold hunters all their lives, and may be supposed to have derived some benefit from their experience. They seldom, however, remained long in possession of rich diggings. Never working with any vigor, they spent most of their time in the passive enjoyment of their cigaritas, or in playing monte, and were consequently very soon run over and driven off the field by the rush of more industrious and resolute men. There were a considerable number of Mexicans to be seen at work round Sonora, but the most of those living in the town seemed to do nothing but bask in the sun and loaf about the gambling rooms. How they managed to live was not very apparent, but they can live where another man would starve. I have no doubt they could subsist on cigaritas alone for several days at a time. I got very comfortable quarters in one of the French hotels, of which there were several in the town, besides a number of good American houses, German restaurants where lager beer was drunk by the gallon, Mexican fondas, which had an exceedingly greasy look about them, and also a Chinese house, where everything was most scrupulously clean. In this latter place a Chinese woman, dressed in European style, sat behind the bar and served out drinkables to thirsty outside barbarians, while 3 Chinamen entertained them with celestial music from a drum something like the top of a skull covered with parchment and stuck upon 3 sticks, a guitar like a long stick with a knob at the end of it, and a sort of fiddle with 2 strings. I asked the Chinese landlord, who spoke a little English, if the woman was his wife. "Oh no," he said very indignantly, "only hired woman, China woman, hired her for show, that's all." Some of these Chinamen are pretty smart fellows, and this was one of them. The The novelty of the show, however, wore off in a few days, and the Chinawoman disappeared, probably went to show herself in other diggings. One could live here in a way which seemed perfectly luxurious, after cruising about the mountains among the small, out-of-the-way camps, for besides having a choice of good hotels, one could enjoy most of the comforts and conveniences of ordinary life. Even ice creams and cherry cobblers were to be had, for snow was packed in on mules 30 or 40 miles from the Sierra Nevada, and no one took even a cocktail without its being iced. But what struck me most as a sign of civilization was seeing a drunken man who was kicking up a row in the street deliberately collared and walked off to the lockup by a policeman. I never saw such a thing before in the mines, where the spectacle of drunken men rolling about the streets unmolested had become so familiar to me that I was almost inclined to think it an infringement of the individual liberty of the subject, or of the citizen, I should say, not to allow this hog of a fellow to sober himself in the gutter, or to drink himself into a state of quiescence if he felt so inclined. This policeman represented the whole police force in his own proper person, and truly he had no sinecure. He was not exactly like one of our own blue bottles. He was not such a stoical observer of passing events, nor so shut out from all social intercourse with his fellow men. There was nothing to distinguish him from other citizens, except perhaps the unusual size of his revolver and bowie knife, and his official dignity did not prevent him from mixing with the crowd and taking part in whatever amusement was going on. The people here dressed better than was usual in other parts of the mines. On Sundays especially, when the town was thronged with miners, it was quite gay with the bright colors of the various costumes. There were numerous specimens of the genuine old miner to be met with, the miner of '49, whose pride it was to be clothed in rags and patches, but the prevailing fashion was to dress well. Indeed, there was a degree of foppery about many of the swells, who were got up in a most gorgeous manner. The weather was much too hot for anyone to think of wearing a coat, but the usual style of dress was such as to appear quite complete without it. In fact, a coat would have concealed the most showy article of dress, which was a rich silk handkerchief, scarlet, crimson, orange, or some bright hue, tied loosely over the breast and hanging over one shoulder like a shoulder belt. Some men wore flowers, feathers, or squirrels' tails in their hats. Occasionally the beard was worn plaited and coiled up like a twist of tobacco, or was divided into 3 tails hanging down to the waist. One man of original ideas, who had very long hair, brought it down on each side of the face and tied it in a large bow knot under his chin, and many other eccentricities of this sort were indulged in. The numbers of Mexican women with their white dresses and sparkling black eyes were by no means an unpleasing addition to the crowd, of which the Mexicans themselves formed a conspicuous part in their variegated blankets and broad-brimmed hats. There were men in bonnet rouge and bonnet bleu, the cut of whose mustache and beard was of itself sufficient to distinguish them as Frenchmen, while here and there some forlorn individual exhibited himself in a black coat and a stovepipe hat, looking like a bird of evil omen among a flock of such gay plumage. Chapter 22.